Saudi Arabia just shut its own wells. 2 million barrels a day, gone. The world's richest petrostate, the country built on pumping, is capping its own fields because it can't ship the oil anywhere. Tanks are full, ships aren't sailing. The buyers in Asia are looking at empty berths. And the kingdom that controls roughly 12% of global oil production is for the first time in modern memory watching crude pile up underground because there's literally nowhere left to put it. And that's not even the worst number, because while the world was watching the Strait of Hormuz, something else was quietly falling apart in the desert. The budget, the megacity, the jobs, the promise. The system that made Saudi Arabia rich is breaking down in real time, on camera. And the reversal is happening faster than almost anyone expected. For decades, Saudi Arabia was the country that broke every rule of economic gravity. A kingdom in the middle of the desert. No rivers, almost no farmland. A population that a century ago lived on dates, camels, and the pilgrimage trade. And then, oil. Lots of it. The second largest proven crude reserves on Earth. Roughly 267 billion barrels in the ground. Saudi Aramco grew into a company worth more than $1.7 trillion at its peak, controlling around 12% of global oil production. That money built everything. The motorways, the skyscrapers, the air-conditioned cities pulled out of nothing. A government payroll that turned the state into the country's biggest employer. A social contract where citizens didn't pay taxes. The oil paid them. There were free schools, free hospitals, subsidized fuel, subsidized water, subsidized electricity. Almost every Saudi household was 1 degree of separation from a government check. It was, on paper, the most generous welfare system in the developing world, and it was funded entirely by something the kingdom didn't have to manufacture. It didn't have to invent, and it didn't have to compete for. It just had to pump it out of the ground and load it onto a ship. The deal was simple. No taxes, no representation, no questions. Just oil money in exchange for political quiet. And for half a century, that deal held. And then came the reinvention. A young crown prince with a vision and a price tag to match. A $500 billion futuristic city in the desert. A $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund. Tourism, tech, sports, entertainment, concerts where there used to be religious police. Stadiums, World Cups, the whole MBS rebrand. Beamed at the world in slick promotional videos and glossy renderings. Now, for a while, the script was working. The numbers back it up. The headlines played along. The capital flowed in. But the entire picture rested on 2 assumptions: that the oil would keep flowing and that the money would keep coming. And this year, both of them failed at the same time. To understand why Saudi Arabia is shutting its own wells, you have to understand a single body of water. The Strait of Hormuz is a 21-mile wide stretch of sea between Iran and Oman. In an average year, around 20 million barrels of oil pass through it every day, roughly 1/5 of the entire planet's seaborne oil supply, plus most of the Gulf's liquefied natural gas, plus petrochemicals, plus ammonia, plus aluminum, plus the raw materials that you build civilizations out of. On March 4th of 2026, Iran closed it. The IEA, or the International Energy Agency, described what happened next as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not the largest this decade, not the largest since the 1970s, but the largest ever recorded. Saudi Arabia was supposed to have a backup. The kingdom built the East-West pipeline years ago to move crude across the country to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, bypassing Hormuz entirely. And it has helped, but the pipeline can't carry everything. So the storage tanks in the east filled up, and then they kept filling, until there was nowhere left to put the oil. That's when Aramco started shutting in the Safina and Zuluf fields. Together, they pump more than 2 million barrels a day of mostly heavy and medium-heavy crude. They're some of the largest offshore fields in the world. And right now, they're sitting silent. Reuters reported that Saudi production has dropped from around 10 million barrels a day to roughly 8 million. A 20% cut. Not by choice, but by force. And here's the part that nobody is saying out loud. Shutting down a major oil well isn't like flipping a switch. Water can seep into the rock. Pore spaces fill. Pressure changes. Some of that production will never come back at full capacity. Engineers in Basra are already warning that some Gulf fields could take months to recover, and that the recoverable totals may be permanently lower. War risk insurance for tankers transiting the strait jumped from 0.125% of vessel value to as much as 0.4% in the days before the closure, adding $250,000 per voyage for the largest crude carriers. After Iran started hitting ships, the insurers stopped writing the policies altogether. 200 tankers were left wandering the Gulf with nowhere to safely dock. The IEA's executive director called the situation the greatest global energy security challenge in history. The country built on pumping has just stopped pumping, and the math underneath that decision is even worse than the war headlines suggest. Here's the part that the war exposed. Now, even before a single drone flew, even before Iran touched the strait, Saudi Arabia was already running a deficit of around 245 billion riyals, about $65 billion. That's 5.3% of GDP, and it came in larger than the kingdom's own pre-war forecasts. The Ministry of Finance had to admit it on the record in the 2026 budget statement. For 2026, the kingdom is projecting another deficit, around 165 billion riyals, or $44 billion. The official line is that this is manageable because public debt is still relatively low, projected to climb to 32.7% of GDP by the end of 2026. Manageable, sure, but the trajectory is the part that matters. Because to plug that 2026 hole, Saudi Arabia plans to borrow approximately 217 billion riyals, about $58 billion in a single year. New bonds, new sukuk, new syndicated loans. The National Debt Management Center had already secured a $13 billion 7-year loan just to keep the lights on at power plants and water utilities. That's not borrowing for a future highway or a future port or a future investment that'll pay itself back. That's borrowing to keep the existing system running. There's also another pressure point underneath all of this that almost nobody outside of Riyadh talks about. Aramco, the kingdom's crown jewel, has been paying out enormous dividends to keep the budget afloat. When oil revenues came up short, the government leans harder on those dividend checks. But every extra riyal pulled out of Aramco today is a riyal that doesn't get reinvested into the wells, the pipelines, and the maintenance that keep the company producing tomorrow. The kingdom is, in effect, eating its seed corn to feed itself this year. And here's the killer number that the budget statement won't print on the front page. The IMF's most recent estimate of Saudi Arabia's fiscal break-even oil price, the price at which the kingdom's budget actually would balance, is somewhere around $91 to $98 a barrel. Yes, Brent is above $100 right now. It briefly hit $126 last month, and the dated Brent benchmark, which prices most of the world's real-world oil, printed an all-time record high of $144 a barrel on April 7th. But you can't earn break-even on barrels that you can't ship. The wells are shut. The strait is closed. The cash that was supposed to balance the books is sitting in pipelines and tank farms with nowhere to go. Foreign refiners that depended on Saudi crude are scrambling for replacements. Long-term contracts are being renegotiated under duress. And the checks from Aramco that the budget was built around are about to come up short, at exactly the moment the kingdom needs them to come in big. The kingdom that desperately needed high oil prices finally got them, and it can't sell into them. This isn't supposed to be how the story ends. The whole point of Vision 2030 was that Saudi Arabia would never be in this position again. The plan was to rip the kingdom off oil 1 decade at a time, diversify, build a private sector, move citizens off government payrolls, open the economy, open the culture, bring in tourism, tech, mining, entertainment, sports, anything that wasn't a barrel of crude. And give the reformers credit, some of it actually did work. Non-oil revenue now accounts for about 46% of total government income, a share that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Tourism licenses have jumped more than 40% year over year. The number of licensed hospitality facilities crossed $5,600. Saudi women joined the labor force at the fastest rate in the country's history. And the female employment to population ratio crept up year after year. Foreign direct investment climbed. The non-oil economy grew faster than the oil economy. The country hosted boxing title fights, Formula One races, electronic music festivals, and a ballooning calendar of international conferences. And in the first quarter of 2025, the unemployment rate among Saudi nationals fell to 6.3%, the lowest level ever recorded by the General Authority for Statistics. For 1 quarter, it actually looked like the reform machine was running ahead of the oil clock. The IMF upgraded its growth forecast. Investors started talking about a Saudi miracle. Vision 2030 even had a Phase 3 rollout with new targets pushed out to 2028 for exactly 1 quarter. Then the numbers started moving the wrong way. By the second quarter of 2025, Saudi national unemployment ticked up to 6.8%. By the third quarter, it was 7.5%, and by the end of the year, it settled to 7.2%. Not catastrophic, not yet, but for a country that just hit a historical low and was supposed to keep grinding the number down toward Vision 2030's target of 7%, the chart turned the wrong way for 3 straight quarters. The picture inside that headline number is uglier. Unemployment among Saudi women climbed back over 10%. Among Saudi female youth, the very group that Vision 2030 was supposed to lift up, well, it sat near 20%. Labor force participation slipped. The employment to population ratio for Saudis ticked down year on year for the first time in this reform cycle. In a red tier system like Saudi Arabia's, this is the warning light on the dashboard, because the state is the traditional employer of first resort. When government hiring slows, when subsidies tighten, when the gigaprojects start cutting headcount, those numbers bend the wrong way fast. And once they bend, they're hard to bend back. It's worth pausing on what that means in human terms. Saudi Arabia has one of the youngest populations in the developed world. More than half of the citizen population is under 35. Every year, hundreds of thousands of new graduates enter the labor market expecting something close to what their parents got: a stable government job, a guaranteed paycheck, a clear ladder. The economy now needs to produce that ladder out of private sector jobs that often pay less, demand more, and don't come with the same prestige. If Vision 2030's transition slows, those young Saudis don't just get unemployed, they get angry. The Giga Project has already started cutting headcount, long before the war, long before the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, the country's flagship project, the single most expensive symbol of the entire Vision 2030 dream, was already quietly in free fall. Hey, if you're watching this and wondering how the world's richest petrostate ended up right here, well, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because what we're about to show you next is the number that MBS's team has spent years trying to keep out of the headlines. It was called The Line, a 170-kilometer mirrored skyscraper running through the Saudi desert. 2 parallel walls of glass, each 500 meters tall, taller than the Empire State Building. A car-free, climate-controlled linear city designed for 9 million people. The centerpiece of a $500 billion megaproject called Neom, the boldest urban experiment ever attempted, marketed to the world with flying taxis, high-speed trains, and an artificial moon. That was the rendering. Here is the reality. On September 16th of 2025, the Public Investment Fund, Saudi Arabia's nearly $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund, formally suspended construction on the line. Not delayed, not rescheduled, but suspended. Out of 170 kilometers, exactly 2.4 kilometers of foundation work had been completed. That's about 1.4% of a project that was supposed to be the future of cities. The original 2030 population target was 1.5 million residents, and it's now been revised down to fewer than 300,000, an 80% cut. Officials are quietly admitting the full vision won't be ready until 2045, and even now that timeline looks generous. The PIF wrote down $8 billion from the project last summer. Neom's CEO walked. More than 1,000 staff were relocated out of the construction site to Riyadh. The 2029 Asian Winter Games, which were supposed to be hosted at the desert ski resort Trojana, another Neom subproject, were yanked and handed to Almaty in Kazakhstan. Saudi Arabia lost the games to Kazakhstan. And then it got worse. The Wall Street Journal reported on an internal audit of Neom that found, in plain language, evidence of deliberate manipulation in the project's financial models. Managers had inflated projected hotel rates and revenue assumptions to justify ever higher cost estimates. The original $500 billion price tag? Well, an updated internal estimate now puts the lifetime cost as high as $8.8 trillion. $8.8 trillion. For context, that's roughly 9 times Saudi Arabia's entire annual GDP. The kingdom has already spent more than $50 billion on Neom, and the visible result is a few kilometers of foundation work, a luxury island, a hydrogen plant, and a desert dotted with half-finished construction sites. The original first phase of the line was supposed to deliver 20 housing models across 16 kilometers by 2030. That target has already been cut to 3. Some of the foundations that were poured for the original layout are now redundant, built for a city that won't be built. Promotional videos used to show flying taxis, robot maids, an artificial moon. The robot maids never materialized. The artificial moon quietly dropped. The flying taxis became a partnership announcement that never produced a vehicle. What is happening at Neom now, by every measure, is a quiet rebrand. The pitch has shifted from the city of the future to AI infrastructure. A $5 billion deal with a company called Datavolt was announced earlier this year to build an AI data center campus at the industrial Neom subzone of Oxagon. Bloomberg has reported that more deals with Western hyperscalers are in advanced talks. It is, in fairness, a more realistic business than building a 170-kilometer mirrored city. But it's also a quiet admission that the original Neom, the one that MBS introduced to the world in 2017, is finished. What's being built in the desert now is a server farm with a famous name attached to it. And here's the single most damning fact about how serious the kingdom is now about Neom. When the Ministry of Finance released the 2026 pre-budget statement, the project wasn't even mentioned. Not as a line item, not as a priority, not even as a footnote. The flagship of Vision 2030 had quietly disappeared from the budget. So why doesn't Saudi Arabia just pivot? Pump more oil, raise prices, ride out the crisis the way that it has before? Well, because every lever the kingdom used to pull is jammed. Lever 1, Aramco's expansion. For years, Saudi Arabia operated on the principle that there was always more capacity if the world needed it. In early 2024, Aramco quietly canceled its plan to expand maximum sustainable capacity to 13 million barrels per day by the end of the decade. The new ceiling stayed at 12 million. The always more oil assumption was already gone before the war started. Lever 2, OPEC discipline. The cartel only works when its members agree to act as one. In early 2024, Angola walked out, fed up with quota disputes. The signal to other smaller producers was unmistakable. The cartel is no longer the unified bloc that it used to be. Lever 3, market share. While OPEC has been managing supply, the United States quietly set a new annual record for crude oil production in 2025, roughly 13.6 million barrels per day. Every barrel the cartel withholds, American shale is happy to replace. Saudi Arabia can cut, but the buyers no longer beg. Lever 4, the security shield. For roughly 80 years, the kingdom traded oil for American military protection. That arrangement guaranteed that ships could move and money could flow. The Hormuz crisis just demonstrated in front of the entire world that the shield no longer guarantees anything. One angry neighbor closed the strait. The protection didn't open it. American carrier groups are in the Gulf right now. They're not getting the tankers through. There's even a fifth lever that the kingdom used to count on, and it might be the most damaging of all. For decades, Saudi Arabia could quietly assume that the world would always need its oil. That demand was infinite, that every projection from every major energy agency would keep pointing up and to the right. Today, those projections are split. The International Energy Agency now models a flattening of oil demand by the end of this decade in its main policy scenario. OPEC's own outlook still projects growth, but the disagreement itself is the problem. The consensus that Saudi Arabia's biggest export had a guaranteed customer, well, that consensus is gone. Every one of these levers is jammed. None of them are moving the way that they used to. And the kingdom is left with the one thing it spent 50 years trying to escape: dependence. So what does collapse back into poverty actually mean for a country that's sitting on more than 260 billion barrels of crude? It doesn't mean tents and camels. The oil's not going anywhere. The reserves are real. Saudi Arabia is not going to look like its pre-1932 self. The poverty here is a different kind. It's the poverty of a kingdom that can no longer write the checks that the social contract depends on. Slower public hiring, quieter subsidies, fees creeping in where there used to be none. Megaprojects shrunk into press releases. A generation raised on Vision 2030's promise, watching that promise quietly get edited down. Module by module, kilometer by kilometer, rial by rial. It's the poverty of expectation. Of a country told for 30 years that the future would always be richer than the past, suddenly being asked to make peace with the opposite. Of young Saudis who were promised a job, a home, a place in this futuristic city, and are now being told to wait 20 more years for a project that may never be built. of a state whose entire legitimacy rests on the ability to pay, suddenly running out of room to write the checks. That is the kind of poverty that matters in a country like this. Not the absence of wealth, the absence of the system that turned wealth into stability. And once that system starts coming apart, the second order effects hit fast. Capital starts looking for exits, foreign investors get nervous, sovereign debt costs creep up, and the political pressure inside the kingdom, which has been bottled up by petrodollars for 50 years, starts to look for somewhere to go. The oil is still in the ground. The system around it is what's breaking. And the most dangerous part isn't the deficit. It's not the shut-in wells. It's not even Neom. It's that all of these started before the war. The war just turned the lights on. Saudi Arabia was already drifting toward this moment when the first drone flew. The Iran crisis didn't cause the collapse. It exposed it. So here's the question. Is this the turning point that the kingdom can't recover from? Is Saudi Arabia about to slide into the slow structural decline that every petrostate eventually fears? Or is MBS about to pull off the most expensive save in modern economic history? Restructure the entire bargain, swallow the political pain, and convince the world that the future is still on schedule. Because make no mistake, every oil empire in history eventually faced this exact moment. The moment when the resource that built the country became the thing the country could no longer rely on. Some adapted. Most didn't. The ones that didn't are now footnotes. Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And subscribe to Fall of Nations for more frontline reporting on the countries that are quietly coming apart.